Alright, so today we're going to be calculating midpoint from points in the coordinate plane. So far we've already talked about midpoint, and we know that the midpoint is the middle point on a line segment, so it makes sense that it's called the midpoint. So we've seen two different examples of how we can use the midpoint to help us solve. The first one, we're saying, okay, well if M is the midpoint, then I can have a situation like this, where each piece is congruent, because I know that if this is the middle, then these have to be the same. So I have this piece, and I know the total. So I can say that my congruent part plus my congruent part is equal to the whole. And we've seen this in segment addition, and then we saw it again in the midpoint, that this piece plus this piece equals the whole. So something like 2x plus 2x equals 20. And it just so happens that these pieces are the same because this is the middle. We've also seen the example where they tell us that this is the middle, and they say, well, this is 2x, and this is 10. So then we use this idea where the part is equal to the part. Because, again, midpoint means that our two sides are congruent. So then, rather than saying part plus part equals the whole, we just say, well, I know these things are the same, so I can set them up equal that way. So we've seen a few different variations of how we can use a midpoint to solve, but so far, this has all just been in space, in 2D space, just points, lines, and planes. We haven't really looked at the coordinate plane. So what happens when we start to look at ordered pairs and we start to get in the coordinate plane? Now what do I do if I want to find the middle? Now instead of just saying, oh, well, I'm just going to draw lines and they're going to tell me points, I have to use this coordinate point, these coordinate planes, so that I have 1 unit, 2 units, 3 units going up and down. And if I draw here, this distance between this point and this point, there's 3 units in between there. And if I want to compare how many spaces are in between these 2 points in this direction, well, I can count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 units. So now I want to find the middle of this. Well, essentially, I want to find the middle of the distance going up and down, and the middle of the distance going side by side. So how am I finding the middle of 3? Well, what's the middle of 3? How would I figure that out? Well, I would do 3 divided by 2, because I want to cut this 3 spaces into half. And that's going to give me 1.5. So I know that I want to get halfway in between this 3. And if I kind of carry that over, that's going to hit right about here on the line. But I can't just worry about the middle of this distance, I also need to worry about the middle of my red distance. Well, how do I find what's the middle of a segment that's 6 inches long? So again, I'm going to do 6 and I want to cut it in half, and that's going to give me 3. So I know that I need to have 3 spaces on either side. So again, 1, 2, 3, that's going to be about right here. And then again, I want to bring that down. When I find the middle of the side direction and the middle of the up and down direction, where those two things intersect, that's where I get my midpoint. So this point right here is actually my midpoint. Now, this is where it gets tricky, is they want us not to say 1.5 and 3. That's telling us in relation to the distance of 6, in relation to the distance of 3, how many spaces we want to count over to get to the middle. But that's not telling us anything about the middle of this segment. Right? What I really want to do is find this ordered pair. So if I'm starting at the origin, I'm going over in the x direction 2 spaces, and then I have to go down 1, 2, and then because I was doing 1.5, I'm not going a full 2 spaces, I'm not going a full 3 spaces, I'm going to be at about 2.5. This is my midpoint. Now that's kind of tricky, especially when we have our fractions, when we have all these crazy things going on. So we can use this concept of what we just did, finding the middle of the x distance and the middle of the y distance using a formula. Really, all this formula is doing is taking the average of my x's and my y's. Alright, so here, how did I get 6? Well, let's look at the ordered pairs that I have. This ordered pair is going to be for 5, -1. And this ordered pair is going to be -1. And then 1, 2, 3, 4. These are my 2 points. So if I'm looking at the x from 5 to 1, how many spaces are between a +5 and a -1? Well, we can take the difference. So 5 minus -1 is going to give me 6 spaces. How many spaces are between my y's? Well, 4 minus -1 is, okay, I caught it. So this should be a -1, a -4. So that's -4 minus a -1. This becomes a plus, so this becomes a -3. Now, what we really just did was find the distance of each segment. This 6 spaces I found from subtracting my x's, or adding my x's. Over here, I found this number of spaces by subtracting my y's. So 3 spaces. Now I'm not going to have a negative distance because it's 3 spaces. So using our ordered pairs, we can already start to see that we're getting the same things that we were getting when we were counting using the graph. So going back to this concept of average, I want to find the average of my x's, I want to find the middle of my x's, and I want to find the average of my y's, the middle of my y's. So I take my x's, and I do 5 plus -1 when I average and divide by 2. Over here, I'm going to do the average of my y's. So here's my y's, -1 plus -4, and I divide by 2. And this is all going to be an ordered pair. Well, what's 5 plus -1? That's going to give me +4 divided by 2. -1 plus -4 is -5 divided by 2. And 4 divided by 2 is 2. -5 divided by 2 is going to be -2.5, which, when I plotted my midpoint, I forgot that I went over 2 and down 2.5. So now we can see, using the average of the ordered pairs, finding the average of the x's and the average of the y's, just plops out that number that we kind of had to do a little work for. We had to count up our segments and then divide by 2, and then we had to kind of trace it down, and we had to count up and trace it over, and then from there we had to use our ordered pairs. This is just going to give it to us. So let's go ahead and try and do this using this concept of average, and then we can go back and check using the graph. So here my average of these 2 points. So my first ordered pair is going to be -1, and then up +4. My second ordered pair is going to be +3 and down -2. So we want to average the x's and the y's. So add up and find the middle of the x's. So my x is -1 plus 3. Find the middle of that. Then I want to average the y's. 4 plus -2, and find the middle of my y's. And that should give me the point right smack dab in the middle. So here, let's simplify. -1 plus 3 is 2 over 2. 4 plus -2 is 2 over 2. So 2 over 2 and 2 over 2 gives us just 1 over 1. So that should be the middle of my equation. So here I have 1 and 1. And again, we can kind of check by looking for those averages. So here, I want to see what's the middle of this point. So I went 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 total, so the middle would be 1, 2, 3, and I would trace that straight over. So that does look like it's the middle of the y's. Now let's find the middle of my x's. This goes 1, 2, 3, 4 segments long, so divide that by 2, that's going to be 2 on each side, so 1, 2. If I trace that up, and sure enough, that is actually the middle of my x's and the middle of my y's. So this is a formula that you can use. It's really just finding the average, right? And they call this formula the midpoint formula. The midpoint formula, which is really just a fancy way of averaging your x's and your y's. Right. So, if we're going to write it out with proper notation, it's x1 plus x2. The two x's divided by 2, and your y1 plus y2, and we're finding the average of that. So the midpoint is just using two ordered pairs. x1 is from the first point, x2 is from the second point, y1 is from the first point, y2 is from the second point. So finding the average of these two things, and again, that's using x1, y1, x2, y2, and it's just finding the average. So let's practice some of these without a graph. They want us to find the midpoint of a segment with endpoints at 6, -3, and 2, -1. So again, I want to think average. Anytime I see midpoint or middle, I'm really just averaging that. Average. So to kind of write it out shorthand, I just do x plus x, y plus y, average of x's, average of y's. So here I'm going to do 6 plus 2 divided by 2, -3 plus 1 divided by 2. So 6 plus 2 is 8 divided by 2. -3 plus 1 is -2 divided by 2. And my midpoint is going to be 8 divided by 2 is 4. And -2 divided by +2 is -1. And that's it. It's that easy. So anytime you see midpoint, just think average. Average the x, average the y. Let's try another example. Here they want us to find a midpoint between -7, 4 and 3, -10. So again, x plus x divided by 2, y plus y divided by 2. So let's find the average of my x's. So -7 plus 3 divided by 2. The average of my y's is going to be 4 plus -10 divided by 2. And I simplify. -7 plus 3 is -4 divided by 2. 4 plus -10 is -6 divided by 2. -4 divided by +2 is -2. -6 divided by 2 is -3, and that is my midpoint. Alright, so make sure you really understand that you're averaging when you're finding the midpoint using coordinate points. Also, make sure you know this formula, which we don't really think it's a formula because it is just average and average, right? But you need to know how to find these points. Then the last example is a little bit of a twist. So here they tell us the endpoint is A. Alright, so the endpoint of AB, so I have segment AB. One endpoint is -5, -10. I know that my midpoint is 4, -3. They want me to find the other endpoint. I need to find this. Well, I don't know how to do that, but I do know that I'm going to have some x and some y for my answer. So how can I do this? Well, there's a few different ways. You can count. That might be a little tricky. So an easier way is to work backwards. If I know that x1 plus x2 divided by 2 and y1 plus y2 divided by 2 gives me my midpoint, and I already know my midpoint, I know that this thing gives me 4 and this thing gives me -3, I need to work backwards. And I also know that I have some of this information. I know that my x1 is -5. I also know that my y1 is -10. So all I really need to do is just set up an equation kind of working backwards. So I know my first x, -5, plus whatever this thing is, -5 plus x divided by 2, that average of these two x's has to give me 4. So if I average the two x's and divide by 2, I should get what they're telling me my midpoint is. Same thing with the y. I know what my y is for one of the endpoints, so I know that this y and this y, when I average them together, -10 plus whatever that y is, averaged together, should give me -3, which is the midpoint, which they're already telling me. So we use this kind of working backwards thinking. Now I need to find this x. Well, how do I find this x? I got to get rid of 2. I'm multiplying on both sides. So -5 plus x equals 8. And then I still need to get this x by itself, so I add 5 to both sides. So my x is 13. Here I need to do the same thing to find my y. I multiply by 2, multiply by 2. So -10 plus y equals -6. I'm going to add 10 and add 10. So y is going to be equal to -6 plus 10 is 4. This is my x, this is my y, so my other endpoint has to be 13, 4. So I can go back and kind of check my work. If I'm saying that this is 13, 4, then that should mean that -5 plus 13 is 8. Average that divided by 2 is 4. That works. I should also be able to average my y. -10 plus 4 is -6. Average it, divide by 2, gives me -3. So this is a missing endpoint. So this is a little tricky. We will talk about this more in class, but make sure you have your working backwards formulas in your notes. And then there's an example for you to try and practice on your own. So here, find the midpoint, use the graph if you need it to help you, or you can do like we did and find just the ordered pairs and calculate it. Number 2, you're going to find the midpoint. Find the midpoint using these endpoints, using our average formula. And here, this is our work backwards example. If one endpoint is this, then we want to find the other endpoint if we know what our midpoint is. So try your best with these, and we'll come back and talk about them in class. See you then.